Welcome to another episode of Cannon Calls. I'm your host, Jake McAtee, and this week is a special one as I have a good friend on to talk about all that is happening in China in relation to the persecution of Christians there, especially with what's going on with Early Rain Church and their pastor. To protect the church and folks involved there, we've left out his name, and so without further ado, meet my good friend. Okay, welcome to another episode of Cannon Calls. I have a good friend of mine. Can I say that?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say. Are they going to stalk
Yeah,
my
a good friend
Facebook
of mine's fine.
list?
Yeah, no.
Okay, good friend of mine who does mission work in China, and enough of it that we can't even really use his real name.
Yeah. It's exciting.
I know it is
It's
thrilling.
serious.
It's thrilling.
Yeah.
Actually, before I even did my first episode, I asked you. I was like, dude, we got to have you on for
Yep.
sure. We got to get like the black market views on this thing. So, dude, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, I'm really happy. I'm
Okay, so-
really honored.
Mission work in China, NBA stuff happening. I guess that's kind of blown over. The NBA season has started, so I feel like people have forgotten.
Yeah.
But we got to see there's this season of seeing like NBA players and coaches so compromised.
Right.
Like on this issue. And so that happened for a bit. What is happening in China?
Yeah. So a lot of this is tied to to the government, to Xi Jinping, who's the president of China, and the Communist Party. So before Xi Jinping came to power, how many years ago was that now? That was like 4 years, 5 years ago. I should have looked this up. Yeah, it was maybe five. I'm gonna say 5 or 6. No, more than that. It was 6 or 7 years ago. Anyway, a few
time
years ago. Yeah, he when he first came to power, everybody was pretty hopeful that he was going to bring good reform. He like Trump, he had this platform of clearing the swamp, and when he first came to power, he got rid of a lot of corrupt officials, sent them to prison, and everybody's like, "Oh, good, this is going to be a good president." And the Christians too were very hopeful that he was going to, even bring more openness to the church. Before him, Hu Jintao, he was okay in terms of putting pressure on, putting pressure and oppression on the church and on the Chinese people. I mean, he wasn't that stiff-armed. But when Xi Jinping came to power, they thought, okay, now it's gonna get even better. He seemed to, be a friendly guy and a man of the people. And this first couple of years, that appeared to be the case, and then it became clear why he was clearing the swamp. And he wanted to get rid of all opposition, put his own people in power that would support. Now it appears that he's wanting to be the next Mao Zedong, and this became most clear in let's see. So this was in. So I'm terrible with dates. So it's either at the beginning of 2018 or the end of 2017. He actually modified the Constitution and put his own name in the Constitution, Xi Jinping thought. And this was written into the Constitution, and the only other, it was clear from that he's wanting to sort of establish himself as this new emperor, essentially. So a lot of people, a lot of critics will call him Emperor Xi now. And so this has a lot of ramifications, and we're seeing some of that with the trade war and the whole NBA situation. So the NBA situation is tied to what's going on in Hong Kong.
Okay.
And in Hong Kong, so when Hong Kong was handed back over to the Chinese government, they made a deal with the Communist Party that they could have their own autonomous police force, court system, essentially kind of rule themselves, but they would still be part of China. And this was it was a 50-year deal, so it's I think it was 50 years. where they could be autonomous. And so they call this the one country, two systems policy. But there was a law that was passed that the Chinese government tried passing that said we can try Hong Kong people in mainland courts. And so Hong Kong people said, no, you're overstepping your boundaries. Our deal is that we get to have our own system. And so this was what sparked the protests, because Hong Kong people were saying, no, we don't belong to the Communist Party. We have our own system. And so this was one way of the Communist Party of Xi Jinping trying to get his foot into Hong Kong, his foot in the door, and sort of start exercising rule over Hong Kong. And so then the NBA, he was the owner. Was he the owner of the basketball team or the
commissioner?
Commissioner, okay. Oh no, it wasn't the commissioner. It wasn't the commissioner of the NBA. The first tweet, it was a tweet.
Oh yes,
from
sorry, yes. I forget his name. Anyway,
I'm not a sports guy at all. I don't follow the NBA. So
I think he's like just an office guy.
Was he an office guy? Okay. It seems like he was. He was one of the teams, and he put out a tweet supporting Hong Kong, saying, go Hong Kong. I forget the exact words, and so the Communist Party then came back and said, we're going to ban you from China now. Because in their eyes, if you say, go Hong Kong, it's a slap in the face, and it's a slap in the Communist Party's face and Xi Jinping's face. And so they banned him. And then the commissioner of the NBA kind of came out and kind of flip-flop. He didn't want to commit to either side, and so everybody just kind of hated him.
Yeah.
And there was threats of banning the whole NBA then from China, and
all of this while several NBA teams are there.
Right.
And LeBron James was in China.
And what's important to know too is that the NBA, in my estimation, I've asked other Chinese people too, but and they agree with me that the NBA is more popular in China than it is in the U.S.
Wow.
It's huge there. I mean, it's part of Chinese culture now. I mean, of pop culture for young people especially. Everybody watches it. People love basketball, and so it was a big deal that the Communist Party would want to be willing to ban it from China and risk upsetting so many people.
Yeah. You had a post on Facebook. Maybe I shouldn't say that.
That's like
I saw a post on Facebook.
That's fine, whatever.
Okay, cool. The post on Facebook that you talked about, that could maybe be something strategic rather than seeing this as like, please don't ban us. Obviously, the reason that the NBA is compromised in this is because billions.
Right. Huge market.
Billions.
Yeah.
So you had a take, though, that kind of went the other way and using that as leverage with the culture.
Yeah. So I think if the NBA before, it's kind of, in some sense, it's kind of too late now because just like with any negotiations, who's you want to be you don't want to be the guy on the defensive side, you want to be the guy that's on the offense making the first move, and they lost the opportunity to do that. But at the time, I thought before the government would come out and officially, try and ban the NBA or ban, one of the teams, that the NBA should say, we are going to, of their own initiative, say we're going to leave China if you don't allow freedom of speech. If you don't allow our players and our coaches to speak freely on their political opinions, then we are going to we're going to leave. And if they did that, I think, and if the Communist Party said, okay, fine, leave. Yeah. If they, regardless of if the Communist Party said, okay, we don't leave, then that's a win. And if they said, fine, leave, we don't want you here, then I think that would turn a lot of Chinese people against the Communist Party, against the government. And right now, it's if you ask the average man on the street, their views of, do you like the police or do you like the Communist Party? Most people have kind of just a very they don't have very strong opinions about it. It's as long as they can basically live their own lives, get a job, earn money, raise a family, like they don't really have strong opinions about it. But generally, like, people admire freer country, admire America for the democracy and all of that. But the Communist Party's sort of overreach doesn't get into their daily lives, the average person's daily life, that much. They don't experience, they do have, like, cameras everywhere on the streets, but they don't have somebody, knocking on their doors and, I don't know, meddling in their normal day affairs.
Taking down their Carmelo Anthony posters.
Yes, yeah. But see if that started happening, I think they would lose a lot of popular support, and once you lose the popular support, you're in big trouble. So, and this is why, like, communist countries, especially, like, the media department, the public relations department is so essential. It's so important because you have to control the narrative, the public narrative, the narrative that's going out to the public, what's happening, and they have complete control of social media in China, and so they can form public opinions really easily. But there's not going to be an easy way to explain that if the NBA just said we're gone,
right,
we're gone. So. But it's in some sense it's a little bit too late for that. But I think there's still a lot of positioning that the NBA could do. But they have it has kind of blown over in some. The NBA situation has kind of blown over. They had a few games there recently, and they didn't. The government didn't allow it to be publicized. But they're like huge turnouts at the games, like all the fans were there, and so, I think the government has just kind of tried to brush it aside.
Now, are those games played in Hong Kong?
No. So they were played in mainland. So there was one in Shanghai that I know of, and one in Guangzhou, but they're played in mainland China.
Okay. So I want to ask more about the modern stuff, but can you maybe give me a brief history of maybe the government opposition to Christians in China? I know that, like, I think we've had this conversation before where that used to be the go-to example, Christians in China or the house churches in China.
Yeah.
Like growing up in whether it was youth group or Sunday school or whatever. And then I remember getting into college and then hearing some hot takes about, like, no, it's not actually that way anymore. Actually, it's not as quite as oppressive. And some of that was just sort of Christians reveling in the we live on the margins,
right,
kind of thing. And so then I was like, okay, maybe it's not. And then now it's unmistakable. So you've had some experience, I hear, with this kind of thing. So what's the reality, I guess?
Yeah. So the history of Christianity in China is quite complicated and long. But before 1800s, there were essentially three waves of missions in China, and Christianity first came to China in like 680-ish during the Tang Dynasty, and these three waves, what was first Nestorian Christians, and then Catholics, and the strategy at the time was essentially convert the emperor. If you convert the emperor, they were trying to imitate kind of what happened in Europe. So, like, how did Europe become a Christian nation? Well, the emperor became a Christian, and then voila. And so that was kind of their strategy, and it failed all three times.
Can I know at least like one? Like, how would they have proposed to get to the emperor?
Well,
I mean,
yes. And at that time it was a little bit easier because foreigners were the foreigners were a strange people, like, ooh, a white man, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they came as representatives. I mean, they had the missionaries who came were weren't just
Sure.
the average Joe. They were high officials in the Catholic Church, and they came as ambassadors, of the Western world, and they came with one of the ways they tried to woo the emperor was with Western science and civilization, and so they'd bring maps, world
Yeah.
maps.
Yeah.
Wow, this is
Yeah.
what the world looks like. Or they bring some fancy cuckoo clock or something. And like, wow, we've never
Here's a
seen
gravity
anything like
formula.
this. Yeah, and so how can you resist that? These people, wow, something's happening over there, and so they succeeded in these three waves. The missionaries succeeded in become working their way up and living in the courts and having talking with the emperor. The first one, Alopan is his name in the Tang Dynasty. He was appointed like it was like, what was it called, Archmage of China or something. It was like a really really super high position, and and so they were successful in that regard, and even they got to the point where the emperor said, "Oh, this sounds like a decent religion," but it just didn't take root. And then
Any takes on why before we move on?
yeah, and this is kind of tied. I think it's because and this what I'm learning this from. I'm getting this from one of the pastors we can talk about, Pastor Wang Yi. He's a very influential pastor in China, and he's known in part for his ability to kind of critique culture, Chinese culture from a Western and history from a Western perspective. And his take, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is that they avoided the cross. So the God that they preached, and this was intentional. This was intentional as well. There's Blaise Pascal. During his time, he wrote in his provincial letters. He actually wrote a letter critiquing the Jesuits for the way that they would do ministry, and there was one big obstacle for the missionaries was rights. So we call this the rights controversy. And for example, it was common, you had to sacrifice to Confucius. You get at these temples, you sacrifice to Confucius, or you sacrifice to your dead ancestors. This was a part of Chinese culture, and the question is, well, if you're a Christian, can you still do this? And the Jesuits said, sure. And so Pascal says, they would put a cross, a crucifix inside of their. The Jesuits would tell them, put a crucifix inside of your cloak, your cloak or whatever, and when you're in the temple worshiping Confucius, direct your worship toward the crucifix, toward the image of Jesus inside of your clothes, And so like they would use these very, sort of crafty schemes to try and avoid conflict with Chinese culture. And Pastor Wang Yi says that was the problem, was they didn't bring the gospel into direct conflict with Chinese culture, and this was especially true with the emperor.
Okay.
And so in Chinese culture, they had this long history of essentially emperor worship. The emperor is called in Chinese the Son of Heaven, and he is like the mediator. Like Jesus. He's the mediator between the people and God, and so so in the political realm, there's Pastor Wang he lays it out this way, that there's three levels of worship. There's the political realm, there's the cultural realm. So in the political realm, you worship the emperor. In the cultural realm, you worship Confucius, and then in your sort of private realm, you worship ancestors. And the early missionaries just wanted to avoid creating conflict in the culture, and so they just preached a glorious God who created beautiful Western civilization, and they weren't willing to suffer. They weren't willing to, bear their crosses and possibly be kicked out of China because they weren't refused to kowtow to the emperor. But eventually, then what happened during the Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty of traditional dynasty of China, there was a 100 years of where they banned Christianity, and this what sparked this was an envoy, an ambassador, a British envoy came to China to try and establish trade relations, and a guy named McCartney, George McCartney, and this was in the late 1700s, and the Emperor Qianlong, he was really happy. Oh, good, he's coming to see my greatness, and the people were telling him, okay, when you see him, here's what you got to do. You got to kowtow to him. You got to prostrate yourself before him. And they have in Chinese, they have what is it? It's like you kneel down 3 times, and then you kowtow. You put your head on the ground 9 times or something. They have this this formula. And he said, I'm not going to do that. He said, yeah, first of all, I represent my king, the king of Britain, and my king can't kowtow to your king. But also, I'm a Christian, and I don't even kowtow to my own king. We worship God, and so this he said, okay, get out of here. We don't want you. So this was kind of sparked an animosity toward Christianity, and so there's this 100 years of where they banned Christianity, and it was during this time when a guy named Robert Morrison was the first Protestant missionary in China, and so he came to southern China, and it was illegal for him to come, but he did it, and he legally learned Chinese and started a legal church, house church. It was a very different form than what had previously happened. It wasn't go to the emperor and try and win his favor. It's sneak into the country, and the Protestants, what the Protestants did, their mission strategy was much different. It wasn't go to the emperor; it was go to the people. And so there was this, instead of this move northward toward the capital in Beijing, it was move westward to the inland China. And so, like Hudson Taylor, this was his big thing, the China Inland Mission. They wanted to bring the gospel into the mainland China, and so there was a period of a lot of resistance to Christianity and missionaries getting killed, and the Opium War kind of opened up the China a little bit, and they made part of the agreement was that missionaries were allowed to do work in China, and so things gradually over time got better, and as the missionaries were willing to suffer for the gospel and die, and move inland and live the difficult life, not living in the palace, at the emperor, the gospel started to take root. And so there was before 1949, there was a flourishing of China, of Christianity in China. There was Christian colleges, and not just.
What was the year again?
Before 1949.
Okay.
So this is before the communists took over.
Yep.
So after the Qing dynasty ended, there were actually 2 Christian rulers in China.
Wow.
Which people don't even recognize. People think, well, what would happen if the Chinese president was a Christian? Well, there were already 2 before the Communist Party. There were 2, Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek were both Christians, professing Christians, and during this time, it was relatively good time for the church, and they were not just making inroads into the villages, into the normal life of the people, but there were officials in the government, becoming Christians. And then the Communist Revolution, happened, and communists came to power in 1949. And this is when things started to change. In the beginning, it didn't happen immediately. But what the communists did at first to try to control, part of communist ideology is like the government has to control every aspect of life. You can't have any independent group of people doing their own thing outside of your oversight, and so you have to find ways to control. So the way that they tried to control the church was to sort of require. They created essentially a national church. So they did one for Catholics and then for Protestants, and the Protestant government church is called the Three Self-Patriotic church, and they required all of the Christians to sign. All the pastors, you have to sign up for this Three Self Church, and so they got them to sign in. Then there was this, and at the time it appeared to be okay. Like there wasn't any clear, theological, other than the idea of is Caesar over the church or not. That wasn't in most Christians' minds. That wasn't an issue. And then the Three Self Church, it was kind of broken off during the what we call the Cultural Revolution, which was this really terrible period where most of us know this is when Mao Zedong was at his worst, and lots of people killed, all the educated, the Red Army, he got the young people to sort of rise up and persecute their elders, the learned people, and so all the learned people were sent to the farms in Western China, and they had to labor on these farms, and all religion was wiped out, and to the point of where Mao Zedong's wife said something like we're only going to see a Bible in the History Museum now, or something like that, and so it was a really bad time for the church, and this is where you get all the stories of the martyr, the blood that was shed, and how this is when the big revival of Christianity happened, was during these about 10 years of severe persecution. And so when this is in stark contrast to what happened with the early missionaries in China who were trying to convert China through the emperor. What this great revival that we hear about, this huge rise in the numbers of Christians, didn't come before it wasn't even that period of relative peace before the communists took over. It was during the most severe persecution against Christians during these 10 years. When they're taking up their cross to follow Christ, this is when the church flourishes, and this is where we get the house church. They're meeting secretly in these houses in the villages, and so after the revolution, the Cultural Revolution ends, you've got tons of new Christians out in the villages, and the Communist Party realizes, okay, we made some mistakes, so they give relative freedom again to Christians, but they reestablish this Three Self Church, and it's still, according to the law, the only recognized church, the only legal church is the Three Self Church. So all Protestants are still required to join this, but most of these house churches, wouldn't join it. They're still kind of meeting secretly, and so there's after from the late 70s through the 80s, and through the 90s, the government doesn't, that they want to try and sort of wash their hands of the Cultural Revolution, all that stuff, and so there is this period of relative peace, where legally in China the house churches are still illegal. According to the law, they're illegal. The only legal churches are these government-approved churches, the Three Self Church. But most Christians aren't going to those, and the government isn't doing anything about it. They're just tolerating it. And this was true through the time of Xi Jinping. Before Xi Jinping. So you would hear stories about the poor persecuted Christians in China, but the Christians in China at the time were like, "What are you talking about? Like, we meet freely. I've never seen the police. Police never come to our church. We meet freely." So, for the most part, Americans, their idea of the church in China has been Cultural Revolution China, with all the beatings and all of that, and that just hasn't been the experience for Christians. And but now things are starting to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and that happened when he was elected.
Right. So a few years after he was elected, and that's when the policies changed. So the Communist Party, this was in 2000, and at the so at the end of 2017, they passed this legislation that took effect in the beginning of 2018, and it was new religious regulations, and the religious regulations essentially wanted tried to clamp down on the house churches. And when we say house church, it's important to understand that they're no longer, a lot of these churches are no longer meeting in houses. So after the revolution, the Cultural Revolution, these people who were sent out to the villages start coming back to the cities, and there's this migration, this urbanization that happens, and so we start seeing a lot of these city churches that and the church might have 500 people, and they're renting office spaces, but we still call them house churches. They're unregistered with the church.
Okay.
So
that's the kind of the distinction is they're just unregistered.
Yeah, just
churches.
unregistered. So some people just translate it as unregistered church. And so okay, I forgot where I was going with this. What was the question?
There's something changing now.
Right.
So
right,
he's
the religious
cleaning house.
regulations changed. Right. Okay, so then this regulations now, these new religious regulations that were passed essentially drew the line in the sand and say, okay, we're serious now. Either you join the Three Self Church or we shut you down. And one of the movement, these city churches, these urban churches, one of the big sort of I don't know if I keep using the word revolution. This isn't really revolution. This is a movement that has occurred over the last 15 years in China. The first one was a reformed movement. So the church reformed theology came in through these urban churches and started attracting a lot of not the peasants, but the learned people, the college professors, the doctors, and really attracted to church history and tying the Chinese Christian experience to this larger past, and identifying themselves with their foreign origins, which in the Communist Party's eyes is scary. So the Communist Party, anything foreign is a threat, right? It's a threat to their autonomy. And so here you've got these Christians now who are saying, I'm not first and foremost a Chinese person, first and foremost a Christian, and my father, my real, strictly speaking, my father is not Confucius. My father is Calvin. And so they're viewing themselves, through these spiritual lenses and identifying themselves primarily, as part of this Western tradition, and that is a threat on the Communist Party's, goal of, trying to tie all, make the people dependent on them and, create their own civilization. And you got these people trying to, do this other thing. So that was one threat. And then you've got another threat, another kind of movement was an ecclesiastical movement, where they're wanting to, the urban churches are wanting to create these church. They're wanting to recover a true ecclesiology, a historical ecclesiology where you've got elders, and you've got a system of a group of elders, a session of elders, and a church government that's exercising church discipline, and even this church government, that's scary for the Communist Party. You've got this independent group of people who've got their own, they've got their own money, they're making they're earning their own money, and they've got directing their own funds, doing their own thing completely outside of our oversight.
This seems like autonomy to me.
Yeah, it sounds like autonomy, right? And so these factors made the Communist Party really scared. So they said, okay, we got to clamp down on these guys. And so they passed these new religious regulations that give the people a choice. So either you join the Three Self Church or we're shutting you down. And so this sparked this new wave of.
What year did that really start?
So it started at the very beginning of 2018.
Okay, 2018.
Yeah, last year. So
coming up on 2 years of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what is the relation to that because that started, and it was actually getting a lot of attention,
Yeah.
especially with one particular church, if I remember right.
Right.
And then the Hong Kong stuff started.
Right.
Those are not exactly related, but they rhyme.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah,
Okay.
they're not related to, and it's helpful to understand. I read one commentator who I think was spot on. He said, this persecution against the church is not really, because people will say, well, that's a religious persecution, and Hong Kong isn't religious persecution. But the persecution against the church isn't primarily religious persecution. It's what they're concerned about is not religious freedom. They're concerned about freedom of assembly. And this, the ecclesiology side of things, you got this independent government essentially operating outside of the control of the Communist Party, which is the same thing that Hong Kong is happening in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong
Right.
people are saying, look, we have our own government, we have our own laws, and you can't tell us, what to do. And so that's how they rhyme. That's where the similarity lies.
Yeah, it seems like we in the West have had the advantage of. I feel like the church and state stuff gets really blurry.
Yeah.
When there's this kind of distance,
Right.
and when you have a government who doesn't quite say that, we're not the. They would never say we're God and man.
Right.
we like they would never say that because we live in a world where we have a history of saying no, Jesus is that.
Right.
We live downstream far enough that nobody really remembers that that's why we say that, or why that kind of break would be there. But it's been helpful for me with China to think like, no, I mean, a government like that is claiming every sphere of your life.
Yeah.
And any kind of break, any kind of autonomy is a threat to their control. So whether it is something like Hong Kong, which seems like, well, that seems more governmental rather than religious, but it is religious at its core.
Right. It is. Yeah. And this was, so the pastor Wang Yi that I mentioned earlier. This is his main point too. Is at the core of any culture is worship, and so the question, if you want to understand the culture, you find out what they worship. And so from his perspective, the Chinese people, Chinese culture, it's about the worship of these three: worship of the emperor, worship of Confucius, the Confucian tradition, and worship of ancestors, family worship. And right now, what's sparking all of this is a conflict with the worship of the emperor. And this is something that hasn't happened yet in Chinese. I mean, it started happening with the arrival of the Protestants in the 1800s, and it's coming into relief more clearly now.
It's interesting when you think about, you mentioned like the missionaries coming in 600.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you put yourself back there, rulers have no problem saying, no, but it's God, and then it's me,
Right.
and then it's you.
Right. Yeah.
And then so you have Catholics come over, and they're like, well, kind of, we have a pope.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And then, the Protestants come, and it's just like, no.
Yeah.
That's not actually how it works at all.
Because it is. I mean, you can imagine that the Catholic theology, where you've got the Vatican is its own government. It is its own country, and the Pope has he is a religious leader and a political leader, and in some sense you can point to lots of not just the Pope, but lots of kings in Western history that had that same thing. So in their mind, the emperor in China, he's a religious leader, he's a priest, and he's a king, and they can kind of make it work. It doesn't sound strange, but then the Protestants come and they're like, no, it's not how it works, my friend.
Yeah, it is interesting, with the Facebook debates and everything else, and people that are worried about Christians, especially I feel like maybe in our world.
Yeah.
If I feel like, if I have particular family members, if they heard like really what we think. Well, did you see the article that I think it was like the Christchurch was just in some article.
Right. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, they really believe like the Great Commission. You know what I mean? It's but one of those things. But everybody that loves the division between church and state. I mean, like Christians are made that.
Right.
Like that
Yeah.
only comes with a God man.
Right.
Otherwise, somebody's got to fill the God man position, and it sounds like China or any other government is like, oh, we would like that role.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a common, I feel like a common misconception of Christians want to tear it down when it's like, no, we'd like to keep it where it is.
And so what's happened? The government strategy now against the church is apparently to make examples out of a few select churches. So they're finding who are the loudest voices in the house church movement who are, advocating for these things, and we're going to oppress them very, very clearly, make an example of them, and hopefully scare everybody else into complying to
Got it.
these regulations. And so you mentioned this church, and this is the same. This is the church of Pastor Wang Yi that I mentioned. It's called Early Rain Covenant Church. Early Rain Covenant Church. And by the way, anybody who wants to kind of follow their story, you can go. There's a Facebook page called Pray for Early Rain Covenant Church, and there's like regular updates you can read and find out what's going on there. And there's a lot of other documents on other, like, China partnership. They've got some good resources on Early Rain. So anyway,
We'll make sure there's a link for that, like in the show notes.
oh good,
or
okay.
something.
So but to give you an example of so the government has been Early Rain Covenant Church before all this. I mean, they were pushing a lot of these new reforms within the Chinese church. So the Reformed theology, they started their own Reformed seminary, the ecclesiastical kind of movement, promoting their Presbyterian church, and the earlier house churches it was just essentially a glorified Bible study, and there was no church government. But here you got this church promoting this church government. There's other aspects. Education is a big one. Christian education, where you've no time in since the communists took over has there been any push really to promote Christian education. They took over the Christian schools in 1949, and Christians have just been kind of content sending their children to the government schools and educating them at home since then, much like in the U.S.
I was gonna say most U.S. Christians are gonna say like,
What's wrong with that? Yeah, but I think most American Christians would understand. It's a little bit, the problem is a little clearer when
the
you're
stark,
talking about,
yeah, you're exactly right. And that's what I wanted to finish with at some point, was just saying, like, it's nice to have these examples because American Christians need them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you think, oh, what's wrong with the government schools? But when the government starts, when their ideology starts changing, or they decide we want to impose more of our ideology, than we were doing before. Well, you've already sort of locked yourselves in the system, and now
you're stuck with those.
You're
premises.
stuck with those, yeah. And so Early Rain Covenant Church started this movement to create Christian schools, and which is actually that's been one of the primary sort of really contentious point for the government are these Christian schools, because they're taking Chinese children out of the government's indoctrination system.
Yeah.
How can the government instill its own values when there's no the school, they don't have the outlet of the schools to do so. And so and I'm a big proponent of classical Christian education, classical education, which is another reason why I really love this church, is they're promoting classical Christian education, not just any Christian education, but they're wanting to bring classical education to the Chinese church. And so Early Rain was really just a hotbed for, that was the most obvious target for the government to
Where was
choose.
Early Rain located?
It's in Chengdu,
Okay.
which is right on a map. It's kind of right in the middle. It's where the pandas are.
Okay, where the
So-
pandas are. All right.
So the government has been monitoring this church, and the police will come to the service every Sunday to record Pastor Wang Yi, and so they've kind of been monitoring and strategizing, and they've tried different ways to shut things down. And long story short, nothing worked. But the thing that really sort of initiated this, and we know there have been reports that this is the case. That what really, when the moment when Xi Jinping says, lay down the hammer, was Wang Yi in a sermon he directly named Xi Jinping, and he said, Xi Jinping is persecuting the Chinese church, and if he doesn't repent, he will perish. And and in the context, you can find this clip on YouTube on the Facebook page that I mentioned. And the context is, all of us all sinners need to repent, and but he specifically names the evil of the Communist Party in their persecution against the church, and he says we have the responsibility to tell Xi Jinping that he is a sinner, that he has offended God, and that if he doesn't repent, he will perish, and so he's very full of emotion. He's saying, if Xi Jinping doesn't repent, he will perish, and so this is what pushed him over the edge. Pushed Xi Jinping over the edge, pushed the government over the edge, and so in December of last year, 2018, they raided the church. They took over the buildings, all of the schools, the seminary. They arrested the numbers well over 300 people from the church, and put over 50 of them in jail. Some of them for many months.
Is that the majority of the church? How many?
The church is about 500 people.
Okay.
And 500-600, and then there's been all kinds of monitoring. They'll send police to the homes to literally sit outside of the doors of their homes all day, and either keep them from leaving or follow them when they leave. There's one of the families, their children, their foster children were taken away from them. There's beatings. There's all kinds of things that the government was doing to suppress the church. And right now, Wang Yi is in jail awaiting trial. Actually, his trial, just this news that kind of broke. His trial should be beginning very soon. Nobody knows what the results of that are going to be, but probably at least 10 years in prison or something. But the last year, the early Wang Yi he drafted a statement as a joint declaration, and this declaration essentially says we aren't going to join the Three Self Church. That the church is independent of the state. It's the government. The government has no right to control the church, and we will submit to the government as the God's appointed authority over us, but we will not submit to the to any regulations that require us to forsake these biblical teachings that require us to worship the emperor. And so a number of churches throughout China then sign this joint declaration. And so we've if you look at the churches that sign it and the churches that have been cracked down on, there's a clear correlation that they're kind of using this document as the guide for who to target. So Early Rain's not the only one that's experienced this. There are other churches throughout China, but Early Rain appears to be the most severe example with the kinds of. The government's even been hiring mafia to intimidate members. This has happened multiple times with different families. Where a guy knocks on the door and full of tattoos, and intimidating them to say, you got to move out. You got to move out of here. The landlord, they make up some excuse, with the the landlord is borrowed my money or something, and he's in debt, and so I'm repossessing this, and you got so they have different methods that they're using, sometimes intimidating just Christian landlords, and then the landlords have to kick out the family, so they're kicking them out of their homes and going to their workplaces and talking with their telling their bosses that these people are members of cults, and so you got to fire them. So there's all kinds of methods, and so it's pretty bad for early rain. Other churches, it's important for your audience to know too that like this isn't the normal experience for Christians yet in
Right.
China. So
These are those specifically targeted,
right,
strategically planned.
exactly.
Yeah.
So because you'll see, some foreigner might, American will go to China and visit a church and be like, hey, they haven't had any problems with,
Yeah.
what's the deal?
He gets to take the hot take back to America,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've been talking a lot about unregistered or the house churches, and especially the ones you mentioned that signed that joint statement.
Mm-hmm.
So the three self church.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they play in all of this?
So the three self church, I compare the three self church to kind of a modern day Catholic church in the U.S. in the sense of, you go to there are a lot of believers, Catholics, that don't know what the Catholic Church teaches, right?
Yeah.
So you can find real Christians in the Catholic Church that that are born again, and if you ask them to explain the gospel, they would probably give you probably a simplified version, but they would give you the basic gospel, and I believe Jesus died for sinners, but that's because they're ignorant of sort of what are the main teachings on justification, for example, in the Catholic Church. They don't know what the Catholic Church officially believes, and it's good enough for them to get by. And so for a lot of believers in China, they go to the three self church and they don't even really know that there's a problem. The pastor may be actually preaching the gospel, and in some churches, and there's not a big issue. The critique against the three self church isn't you go to any of these churches and they're just completely corrupt and they're preaching worship Xi Jinping. It's an institutional issue. That all of the three self churches have signed up, whether they know it or not, they have said we are subservient to the Communist Party. The Communist Party has established these two oversight sort of committees, organizations to oversee the Three Self Church, and they direct the seminaries, the Three Self seminaries, and everything, and the theology, which I'll get into in just a sec. So there's not like necessarily a hot debate. If a house church Christian sits down next to a three self Christian, they're not going to be like, oh,
Yeah,
there's still fellowship between a lot of the Christians in the two churches, but there are really bad three self churches and really vocal three self pastors criticizing Wang Yi, and Wang Yi criticizing them. So those debates happen, but where the three self and this is becoming more and more clear now. So the way that the government, the Communist Party, is trying to sort of control the populace in the three self church is through a program called sinicization. Sinicize means if you know like sinology, so like Sino-American relation, it just refers to China. So sinicization means the Chineseification of culture. So this was Xi Jinping's baby, and so they for the last 5 years or so, even less than that, maybe 4 years, he's been promoting this campaign of sinicization, which it's not just in the church; it's overall all Chinese society. But what they mean by it, so it's under the pretense of sort of, we can understand it as like a rediscovering your roots kind of a thing. So showing the world, flexing your muscles before the world, showing the world that we have our own rich history, our own civilization. They like to pride themselves, a longer history than any Western country. They'll say 5,000 years, and scholars question, well, what do you mean by China, and what some will say, well, we only have recorded really 3,000 years, but anyway, they do have a long, rich history with their own philosophers, their own governments, and all sorts of things, and it's really interesting if you study world history. I mean, you've got all this crazy stuff happening in the Western world, and in Africa and Europe, and all these wars and everything, and China's out of the picture. China's is over there doing its own thing.
There's emperors probably, and
yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of,
dragons.
and it is kind of sad. I mean, because I mean, there's really amazing things that happen in China during this time that we don't study, we aren't aware of, but they do have a really rich history, but the Communist Party is using this to try and wean its people off of Western dependence.
Yep.
And they want to instill this kind of nationalism, patriotic spirit, and the Communist Party wants to tie itself to China. When people think of China, they equate that with the Communist Party. That's the Communist Party's goal.
Yeah.
So the Confucius is the Communist Party's ancestor, or the Communist Party is the baby of Confucius. If you want to honor Confucius, then you honor the Communist Party. Which by the way, this whole thing is tied to a traditional Chinese idea of the mandate of heaven, which and we have this similar thing in Western history too. But the idea is heaven, God, shows us his will by, if he's not happy with a ruler, he'll he will kick the ruler off the throne and replace him with this other ruler, and essentially heaven reveals his will through whoever is ruling, and so if the ruler gets killed, and that was clear, heaven wasn't happy with him, and this new ruler is who heaven likes, and so now the Communist Party is trying to show, okay, heaven has appointed us as the ruler, and so we are God's will for you, and so they're pushing the Sinicization campaign, and in the church, you see this very clear. There are lots of videos now coming out of like they're changing the hymnals, so they're putting a lot of communist hymns in the hymnals. So
this is in the Three Self Church.
In the Three Self Church. So you've got congregations during church, singing these patriotic, sort of what our, even, it's not even like God Bless America, not even like that. It would be like a song praising the Republican Party. God bless the Republican Party. That's what we're singing in church, and so that's one example of how they're doing this. But they can find Bible verse. Speaking of Bible, they're retranslating the Bible. Do they have a?
Oh no.
And but they are putting this under the banner of contextualization, right? And we can find examples of Paul saying, "I became a Greek to win the Greeks," and
right.
So the church needs to become Chinese if it wants to win the Chinese. And what does it mean to be Chinese? To be communist. That's what it means to be Chinese. And
it means to be thieves.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so the theology, the Three Self Church published, the government published, the committee overseeing the Three Self Church published a document a year or two ago. It was the 10-year plan for the Sinicization of Christianity in China, and it's really frightening if you read it, and it's like, and they're really direct, and it's like instill communist a love for communist values in all of the pastors, and indoctrinate the Christian children with a love of their communist leaders. It's like that kind of language.
Pretty eerie.
Yeah, and they're very clear on how they're going to do this. They're rewriting the textbooks and the seminaries, and retraining, having these pastoral training sessions on how to preach with socialist values, and it's really frightening. So the Three Self Church is clear. I've been to Three Self churches, and the ones I've been to when I did go to them were relatively good. I'd been to Three Self Bible studies, and nothing that really clearly stood out as heretical or anything like that. But now I'm seeing all kinds of videos and reports of terrible preaching, heretical preaching, and just really messed up worship. And so this is drawing the line in the sand a little bit clearer for Christians. You must choose this day who you follow. Are you gonna go the Three Self route? And I've seen multiple testimonies of people leaving the Three Self Church because of this. And they're receiving news, obviously not from the local media, but from the outside world, of this persecution against the church, and they're starting to see the problem that wasn't so clear before.
So China's big,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the notorious faults of communism, and you mentioned the control of every aspect of life. There's no room for autonomy.
Right.
The way that God made the world, you can't do it.
Right.
So it's just inherently not going to work.
Yeah.
And so are there areas where people, it's obvious these are not, because China, like I said, China's big. You mentioned that was right in the center where the pandas are.
Yeah.
So how quickly did it happen that he heard that sermon? Are they getting more efficient? Are they?
This is one of the notorious aspects of communism, socialism, is when you put the government in charge of everything, they're incredibly inefficient.
Uh-huh.
It's like you can't manage such a large and China is huge.
Right.
And so in some sense, that works to the advantage of Christians in China. It's well, they can't control all of us.
Right.
And so they're having the government I've seen commentators use the word panic, that the government is panicking, things are getting out of their control. So we haven't talked about this yet, but another huge thing that's happening is in Western China is the detainment of Muslims. So the government is they're concerned about the Islamic ideology infiltrating Chinese culture, and so they have essentially created these internment camps for Muslims, and they're re-education camps is sometimes what they're called, and they have the New York Times is reporting that there have been millions in these camps, and they have satellite images of these essentially concentration camps. People are comparing this to Nazi Germany, and they are forced to go there and take these classes, and they won't be allowed to leave until they have changed their mind. And so the government is trying some extreme measures to control, and CNN had a reporter. They did an in-depth thing of what is life like in Xinjiang, is the city where this is really, really bad. It's they had these checkpoints everywhere, and citizens have to walk through these checkpoints and do the hand and eye recognition stuff, and it's really just frightening the extent that the government's going to try to control the Islamic ideology, and so you've got this kind of thing happening in one part of China, where really extreme, really oppressive. We're actually going to come into your home and pull you out of your home, and we're going to do it with everybody to ensure that that this thinking doesn't spread.
Yeah.
But and there's I think that this is a kind of they're doing experiments in different sections. So you see this in a lot of other things, like with, for example, the there's been reports on this new facial recognition software in China that they're rolling out, and the social credit system. I don't know if you've heard of the social credit system, where they're they essentially give everybody a social credit score, and if you do something bad, it goes down, and then you can't like buy plane tickets or
Wow.
travel or whatever. And if you do good things, and you go, and they're
It's like a national FICO score.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
And but to find out the best way to do this, they section out different parts of China, and they experiment in different, maybe different city. They choose a city and say, okay, we have this one version of our system, and it's all tied to facial recognition, so they can track you wherever you go, and then there's a little number that's above your head, and they see what you buy in the store. So if you buy a lot of beer, then your score is going down because that suggests that you are an alcoholic, and it's some of it gets really scary. But they find out they decide on these policies by experimentation. So they experiment in different parts of China. So you end up with relatively one city who just happens to be the free city, the control or whatever. And so I think with that same kind of thing is happening with the sort of persecution. How are we going to control the churches? Well, we're experimenting with different cities, so we know this is the case, like in Chengdu, that it's a local effort. It's not so the higher ups, the president or the national government, they will direct local cities, say, okay, this is the methods that you're going to use, and against the main Protestant churches, you're going to use these forces, and then it's the local authorities' decision, or it's their responsibility to fulfill those requests. So I think there is some measure of delegation happening, where the government knows it can't control the whole country, and so the national government, and so they give local jurisdiction, local authorities jurisdiction over a place, and say, okay, you got the responsibility to take care of these guys, or to use this level of oppression, and so that's why you get these.
It's just like your neighborhood TSA.
Yeah, right. That's
just,
right. Neighborhood TSA. That's right.
Off your shoes.
Yeah, and so some Christians one city over are happily meeting together, and the police know about it, and nobody cares, and that's because it's not a national thing where everybody's being controlled the same way. It's local authorities who have their own, the government's given them their own directives to do this. So that's my take. I'm not a national security expert or a national I don't know, whatever they call that.
Right. That's what we need you to say for the podcast. He's not a national security agent.
I'm not a national security agent. Let me make that clear.
Okay. So as far as what's coming down the pike here, there's terms to these elections, because what's his face got elected 7 years ago, however many years ago. The Chinese Christians' hope is in Jesus, but in terms of like relief from oppression, what is their hope? Like, is there a hope in the next election coming soon, or what's likely to happen in the next few years?
So I forgot to mention an important point when I said that Xi Jinping, he modified the Constitution. He got rid of term limits for the president, for himself.
I mean, who hadn't thought of this sooner?
Yeah, right?
I didn't know it could just be fixed.
Yeah, he just erased that. So it used to be 8 years, and now it's no years. Now it's indefinite, and so this is another reason why people call him Emperor Xi. And so what's interesting is before there was hope. It's like, well, no matter how bad it gets, we always have hope that we can change. Our leader's going to change, And And so Pastor Wang Yi and a number of other Christians, they had actually drafted a letter to Congress. They wanted, so they Early Rain Covenant Church and others kind of associated with them, their political, their sort of philosophy of political reform is do so lawfully. I mean, we're not going to go out in the streets and protest and do that. We're going to fight through the courts and appeal to the authorities. So China is a constitutional government. They have a constitution. So we're going to appeal to our constitution and say, look, you oppressing the church like this is unconstitutional. And we have freedom of religion, and so they that was their strategy. And when the government, or when President Xi Jinping changed the constitution, then Wang Yi says he realized it's really if the authorities can change the constitution whenever they want at will,
Right.
then what's the point in appealing to the constitution? They can just change the part that they don't like, and
It now has his name on it.
now has his name on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Pastor Wang Yi said, from that time on, I've resolved I'm just going to appeal to the Bible. So instead of saying, what you're doing here is wrong because it violates Chinese laws, I'm going to say what you're doing here is wrong because it violates God's law.
Yep.
And so that's been for those at the front lines of this house church battle movement, that appears to be where the solace, their peace lies, not in the hope of some political reform anymore. Those that had it were kind of driven to despair, like, oh, there's no hope now. We're stuck with Xi Jinping for our lifetime.
Right.
But there's hope in God, and Wang Yi, one of the sort of outrageous things that he has said. So before he was arrested, he knew he was gonna eventually be in prison, and so he wrote I really highly recommend it. It's a brilliant letter. It's called My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience, and you can find it on Google. And in this, it's his statement. It's his "Here I stand" speech, and he talks about this problem of where do we put our hope? He's speaking to he's speaking not just to the government, saying this is my belief, but he's speaking to the church. He's saying this is why I'm being in prison. And I've got it here. I'm gonna read a couple paragraphs here, and this will give you a sense of how the church, or at least how he doesn't obviously represent all Christians in China, but I think this sentiment is one that many Christians have as they look at their own government with more and more, they see this, they have less and less hope in sort of political change. So here's what Wang Yi says. On the basis of the teachings of the Bible and the mission of the gospel, I respect the authorities God has established in China. For God deposes kings and raises up kings. This is why I submit to the historical and institutional arrangements of God in China. As a pastor of a Christian church, I have my own understanding and views based on the Bible about what righteous order and good government is. At the same time, I am filled with anger and disgust at the persecution of the church by this communist regime, at the wickedness of their depriving people of the freedoms of religion and of conscience. But changing social and political institutions is not the mission I have been called to, and it is not the goal for which God has given his people the gospel. For all hideous realities, unrighteous politics, and arbitrary laws manifest the cross of Jesus Christ, the only means by which every Chinese person must be saved. They also manifest the fact that true hope in a perfect society will never be found in the transformation of any earthly institution or culture, but only in our sins being freely forgiven by Christ and in the hope of eternal life. As a pastor, my firm belief in the gospel, my teaching, and my rebuking of all evil proceeds from Christ's command in the gospel and from the unfathomable love of that glorious King. So he goes on to sort of explain his mission to the church, and he and relating this, he points out the evils of the communist government, and he makes this really important point, I think, toward the end here. He says, if this regime is one day overthrown by God, it will be for no other reason than God's righteous punishment and revenge for this evil. For on earth there has only ever been a 1,000-year church. There has never been a 1,000-year government. There is only eternal faith. There is no eternal power. Those who lock me up will one day be locked up by angels. Those who interrogate me will finally be questioned and judged by Christ. And he goes, it's a really powerful letter, but this idea that there's no 1,000-year government. This is even hard for Christians in America to kind of understand. We just think America's going to be around forever.
Yeah.
And we're so young.
Right.
And just imagine like Rome at its heyday. Somebody saying, the Roman Empire is going to crumble.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Come on. But
hey, if it does, it's the Christian's fault.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And just like Wang Yi pointed out, Calvin said, God's wicked rulers are God's judgment on wicked people, and so there is,
and all of America just thinks about that for a while.
Yeah, right. Man, that's a whole nother episode there.
Yeah.
There's these Christians in China recognize, even though, yeah, okay. So I mean, from an earthly perspective, okay. So maybe Xi Jinping is going to be president for life in China, but he's going to die.
Yeah,
right? He's going to die, and the guy after him is going to die. I mean, there is still it's going to end sometime, but I think the point Pastor Wang Yi is making is not even that. It's not even that, these people are going to die out eventually. It's God in his providence rules history, and the gospel will triumph eventually. And that's where our hope is. We are just like him. My duty as a Christian is to oppose evil, and so I'm going to do that regardless of what the cost is. It might be very costly for me now at this time in this political environment. And the church in China needs to be willing to bear that cross. Because our goal is not, in the moment now, our goal is not to change as a Christian, especially as a pastor. He's speaking as a pastor. It's not to elect the right officials even. That's a good duty Christians we do, but if we don't do that, it's not like we failed our mission
right.
today.
Right.
If I die before transforming this government, then
it's all for loss.
It's all for naught. No, my goal, my duty as a Christian is to bear witness to the cross of Christ, and sometimes that always comes through dying, and sometimes we come out of the resurrection we see the resurrection before we leave this world, but sometimes we go through a whole life and we just bear the cross, and we don't see the fruit of that in our lifetime, and that might be the case for Christians in China now. They might, before they die, they might not see a Christian regime in China. They might not see the political reform that they're hoping for. But there's no need to despair, because we know who rules history. We know that the Chinese government is not omnipotent. It's not eternal, and so we put our hope in Christ. And when you hear not just Wang Yi, but when I read the other church members, when I read other pastors in China, they're expressing the same sentiment. Like, in some sense, this has been, I've heard others comment too, that this is while this persecution is in some way a judgment on God, on China, it's also a mercy because Wang Yi has commented before too that he has been nervous for the church in China because there has been this 40 years since the Cultural Revolution of peace where this generation, the generation that grew up during this time, hasn't really known what it means to carry a cross. They haven't experienced what their fathers and mothers experienced, during the Cultural Revolution, and that the danger is you've got these cultural Christians, who and many are leaving the church because of the persecution that's happening, but it has a refining effect on the church, and so I've seen multiple people sort of express that sentiment too, like this is a blessing for us because we haven't had the opportunity to suffer in this way for a while, and we know that that's when God has blessed the Chinese church historically in the past, is when we've taken up our crosses and suffered. So there is there is hope in those words. But again, every Christian is different, and you'll still find Christians who are just like I see on Facebook all the time. People say, they'll see some new news article and say, I want to leave China. I can't wait to get out of here, and I want to say, like, I mean, when I see bad things happening there, I'm like, man, I want to be there, and when some Christians are, they're there, and it's understandable, but they're a Christian teacher, in a college, and the government has some new thing where they have to teach some communist thing, and they're just fed up and frustrated, and I just want to get out of here, and that's understandable, but you get the opportunity to bear witness to the cross of Christ. Like that's a great privilege, and it's fleeing the cross, fleeing the persecution, isn't going to really solve it. It might make you a little bit comfortable, but the only thing that's going to bring about real change in Chinese society is if you face that with courage, and so that's what really encourages me about people like Wang Yi and members of Early Rain is, you see them facing this opposition with faith, and not running from it, but I don't want to glorify the church either. We can do that. Americans have a sort of an obsession with sort of glorifying martyrs in a bad way. There's a good way to glorify martyrs, but there's also like making a martyr out of everything.
Just relishing being on the margins.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And we need to be careful. I also read another pastor, not from Early Rain, but another church in Chengdu, who said, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, the persecution is a blessing for us, but persecution itself isn't a blessing or a curse. It's a blessing for some people and a curse for others. And he said, there are people in our church who have really fallen, they've fallen headlong because of the persecution. They're doing really poorly spiritually, and there's others who are thriving in it. And so what matters is do we have persecution? It's, am I walking with Christ, right? If you're walking with Christ, then when persecution comes, you will thrive. But if you're not walking with Christ, then the persecution is just going to expose that. So we have to be careful of sort of seeing the persecuted church and just saying, praise God. We should rejoice. And Jesus says rejoice. But it's not just all, nice stories. There's a lot of real suffering that the church is going through, and Christians are going through. So it hurt, and the cross is painful. And it's important to realize that, I think, too.
Well, I'm humbled. For sure. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah. It's a privilege.
I would love to have you back when anything China happens. Keep us updated.
Yeah, I'd love to.
I'm going to put the Early Rain Church Facebook, Pray for Early Rain, in the show notes.
Okay.
Is there anything else I can point people to, or?
Yeah, I mean, Google is your friend.
Google.
Yeah, there's a lot of, especially with Early Rain. There's a lot of news. I mean, all the major news organizations have written on it. There's a you can also include a link to China Partnership.
Okay.
They have their mission is essentially to translate resources from the Chinese church into English, so that we can get a sense of what are they saying on their Christian blogs and in their theological articles. What are they talking about? And they have some good resources that'll kind of and summaries of what's going on there. So yeah, you could include that as well. There's also maybe one more we can include also, China Source. They do something similar to China Partnership, but that gives you a little bit broader idea of the sort of in the realms of culture and politics. What's from a Christian perspective, what's going on, what are the important developments. So China Source, China Partnership, and then I think Pray for Early Rain Covenant Church, the Facebook page, is a good way to kind of just look at one church. What's one church going through there?
All right, them all. Thank you, man.
Yep. Thank you.